Everyone. At least on my screen, it shows up in the bottom right. I'm not sure where it is in yours, but there's a chat box. And the chat box is good for asking questions and also solving problems, asking for further information, a reference. Repeat that, please, whatever you want, in order to prevent kind of anarchy, which I still remember the very first webinar we did when we really didn't understand this technology. It was anarchy. There was one man who had his camera on and was getting dressed. That was during the session, so it was chaos. So we control that now by asking you to ask your questions in writing in the chat box. My chat box is currently showing empty. So I would appreciate if somebody would just write hello or where you are, put your location in, just something to show everyone that the chat box is working. Now, people might find it interesting if everybody says where they are, just to show the variety of locations of people participating in this webinar. So just enter your location into the chat box. I'm hoping that I'll be able to see it. There we are. Good. Okay. Scott, Arizona.
Silvers are in their dining room.
North Oaks, Minnesota. Okay, it's working. Good. Scottsdale. I'm in Vancouver, British Columbia. Let's see what I can see here. I just lost my view. No, I don't want that. Okay, so let's begin. As I said, Jeff will mute everyone, and then you'll ask questions and give comments and so on in the chat box. I may not be able to pay attention to it too much as we go in order to keep concentration, but I'll talk for about 30 minutes, and then I'll take a good look at the chat box and see if there's anything in there that you've asked that I can respond to at that time, just to keep the flow of the conversation. So welcome to everyone. It is a real pleasure. You are among the first people to be doing the Seeking Everyday Holiness course. Myself and Judith Deruchis is on this call, and a number of other people have been working on this program for over a year. It was actually hatched at the biennial in San Diego, which was December of last year, so it really has been close to a year. We've been working hard to create a program that we hope will give you a very good introduction and grounding in Musar as a Jewish tradition of study and practice. The program will come with webinars like this that will be run periodically. And just like this one, we're having a chance to meet live in person from wherever there will be groups. As time goes on, there will be more and more groups, God willing. We know there are another 7 cities signing on in January. So as time goes on, it'll be very exciting to see that we're participating in a webinar with people from many places, and that's one of the things technology makes possible. I can be here in Vancouver, British Columbia, as I am, and meet with you and share this holy time together, even as we're in such different geographical locations. It's quite a miracle. I'm the dean of the Mussar Institute and the associate dean of the first who lives in Israel. And if we can work out the timing, which means he has to stay up very late one night, he may well need a webinar as well, which is pretty exciting. You can have a teacher in Israel teaching people all over the world all at the same time. It's a gift of technology. So I wanted in this very first webinar that you're participating in to talk about the goals of Musar. And that has been written into the materials. I certainly talk about it in Everyday Holiness, which everybody should have a copy of. And yet I still feel like there's something valuable in sort of opening up that subject. It's one thing to mention it and then you go on in your reading. It's another thing to say, let's hold up here and let's dig down a little deeper and expand our understanding, because the goals of anything are extremely significant. They become the anchor or the orientation point that makes sense of everything else. If we understand and really grasp and internalize what this is all about, that's the goals, then everything that comes along the way makes sense. You can understand why we've set things up, why we're asking this of you or suggesting this to you, because it's all going in a certain direction. It's just like a GPS in a certain way. The first thing you have to do is put in the destination. And the goals of this practice and this tradition are defined by they define the destination we're working towards. In the end, it's not really a destination. It's much more an orientation point. As you'll see, I'll make the point, you never get there. You never get there, but it tells you which direction you're going. As you go through the program, Seeking Everyday Holiness, you'll find that for 2 weeks at a time, we're focused on the cultivation of various inner traits. This is very much the nature of Musar practice. And you can go back to books that were written in the 12th century, or the 13th century, or the 16th century, and you'll find that the entire focus of those books, including all that's listed in their table of contents, is focusing on various inner traits so that we can understand them, understand what's good in them, understand what's negative in them, understand how to work with them, and then through that, accomplish what Musar sets out to do. And that's what I want to talk about today. Because we can become very focused on anger. We're very focused on patience, or generosity, or gratitude. And in a sense, we can lose the forest for the trees. We can become so engrossed in the mechanics, we lose sight of the goal. The Mussar teachers really talk about two goals, one primary, one also very significant, but another take on the primary goal. The first one is holiness, kedusha in Hebrew. And it's primary because it's based in the Torah. So much of what constitutes Judaism comes directly from the Torah. And here we find it very clearly articulated in several different places. It comes up many times in the Torah that we do things in order to be holy. And the primary reference is in Leviticus Vayikra, where it says, Kedoshim Tihiyu, you shall be holy. And that is really the driving thrust of what Musar is all about, and part of what makes it so distinctive. This is also something I wanted to share with you this evening. We bother grappling with our impatience, not just to have better relationships, not to suffer so much or cause so much suffering, not just to be nicer people. All that comes along the way, but it's not the goal. It's a byproduct. It's a good index. You can learn a lot from those other things. Those are those feedback mechanisms in the real world. But the goal is clearly stated that all of this work is done because the potential of a human being and the fullest realization of that potential in our lives is to be holy. That's what makes this particular spiritual tradition intrinsically Jewish. Because you can find lots of places where people are telling you how to work on the very same qualities we talk about in this program. You might find people doing anger management courses or sort of relationship management about how to be more generous or how to be more patient or whatever it may be. But they're not necessarily oriented, and almost exclusively not oriented, towards the goal of a Jewish spiritual practice. An authentically Jewish spiritual practice has to have as its goal the pursuit of holiness, because it wouldn't be Jewish otherwise. The Torah is so clear that we're here in the world, to elevate our inner lives, to become vessels of holiness, to become lamps of holiness, to shine holiness into our lives and through us into the world. It's not a self-glorification thing. The flashlight doesn't feel good about lighting up the road. That's just its purpose. But if the flashlight is shining, but it's shining where there's no use for it, it's just wasting its batteries. And so it is with us as well. we are enjoined to cultivate that holiness, not for the sake of our own glorification, but in order to shine the light of holiness into the world, and to be, as Torah says, a light unto the nations. It starts with us as individuals. It's not a thing that can be bypassed. In the Torah, when the talk is about holiness, it's almost always in the plural. And what that means is that this is something that's being spoken to all of us as individuals, a collection of people. When it says, Kedoshim Tihiyu, it's speaking in the plural. You shall be holy, you plural. Everybody here has that mandate of becoming holy. And so this really sets the agenda, because it sets a very high bar, and it makes sense of why there's an issue. Why not just be a raging person? Like, okay, that's how I am. That's my genes. That's my hardwiring. And your job is to accept me just the way I am. That's one way to live, but it's not a Jewish way to live, because Judaism is very deeply concerned with change, with personal change, with developing our potential to the highest possible degree. That's manifest in, just as an example, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, where the whole practice of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur is about taking responsibility for what you did in the last year and resolving to lift yourself up to a higher level in the year to come. I question whether that's enough. In other words, whether you can just do that in a ritual way. Obviously, the whole practice of Mussar says it's got to be a much longer practice. You've got to do more than just, cup your chest and then think that you've made change. It's not so easy. But that aside, you think the theme of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur is clearly personal change. Judaism is very concerned with personal change. There's so many aspects of Judaism which are about lifting ourselves up to our higher level, and that higher level is realm. The whole verse, I only gave you half the verse. The whole verse is Kedoshim Tihiyu Ki Kedosh Ani. You shall be holy, God says, because I am holy. If God is telling us we should be holy because God is holy, what we're learning is that this is a spiritual quality, it's a divine quality, and yet it is a human potential. We have within us tremendous spiritual potential. And the Torah is telling us the best use of a human life is to focus on and enhance and raise up and purify and really bring to the center that spiritual essence of who we are, and that is the holiness that is the inherent quality in every human being. Now, I want to drill down a little bit more because I want to share with you some of what I've learned along the way about what holiness is. As I began my own journey into Musar, I realized everything I've just shared with you, which is that the whole idea of Musar is focused on doing all the work on yourself and understanding yourself, understanding your curriculum, and studying and practicing and changing, not for the sake of self-glorification or to win $1 million, but because this goal of holiness is set out for us as our highest potential, and we're encouraged to pursue it. I'll just say as a footnote, it's interesting that even though it's stated as Kedoshim Tihiyu, when the Rambam Maimonides combed through the Torah and brought out the 613 commandments, you shall be holy was not one of them, not a commandment. And there's various interpretations as to why that is. But one of the Musar teachers said the reason it's not a commandment is because it's actually good advice. The Torah is giving us good advice. We have free will. We can choose what to make the priority in our lives. I read obituaries, and you can tell when someone's life is summed up in 2 paragraphs, you see what they made a priority of. Because sometimes the sports teams they loved are listed, or their love of motorcycles, or their golf handicap, or all kinds of things get listed. We have free will. We can devote our lives to anything. The Torah is giving us advice to pursue holiness because it only becomes meaningful when it's a free will choice. If it's a commandment, I'm only doing what I'm told to do. When we make a free will choice, we're orienting ourselves to our highest potential, and that is holiness. That is our spiritual potential. That's what the Jewish tradition urges us to take on as a free choice and lift ourselves up, recognize our spiritual potential and lift ourselves up to that higher potential and not be caught in all the other things that are attractive and that we may well need to be involved in, but don't become the goal of our life. That is very clearly what the Jewish tradition urges us to do. When I realized that this was really what this is all about, and why it's defined so clearly that Musar is a spiritual tradition, not a self-help tradition, not a psychological tradition, but spiritual, pursuing holiness. Of course, I did not know what holiness is. How would we know? We don't live in a world that talks about holiness. We don't see a reflection. You can't drive down the freeway and see on the billboards or listening to the radio or where's the reflection that's going to give us an understanding of that which the Jewish tradition says is the highest goal and the highest possibility. And we live in a world where at most it's invisible, if not actually debased, saying the opposite is the goal of living. The material is the goal of living. So I found myself mystified, and I called my Mussar teacher, Rabbi Yitzhak Pear. You've got your copy of Everyday Holiness, and you'll see that the book is dedicated to Rabbi and Rebbetzin Pear as my Mussar teachers. And I called Rabbi Pear and I said, Rabbi Pear, I get half of it, but I'm not getting half of it. I get that Kedusha, holiness, is the goal, but I don't know what holiness is. Can you tell me? It's a wonderful thing about having a teacher. You can ask a question like that, because otherwise I wouldn't even know where to go. And he did what a good rabbi does. He first cited to me the sources. He said that Rashi, the Rabbi Shlomo Yitzhaki, who was the primary commentator on the Torah and the Talmud in the 12th century, in France, actually, in Provence, he says something interesting about Kedusha. When the Torah brings the injunction, you shall be holy, Rashi notices where it comes in the Torah and looks at relationships, the relationship of various, how it's placed in the Torah, and he comes to this statement. He says, holiness is what you have when you don't defile yourself. When you separate yourself from the defiling influence, you are holy. It's an unbelievably profound definition, because what it's saying to us is that we all are holy by default. All you have to do is not mess up. Don't take into yourself defiling things, and the natural condition of a human being is to be holy. It's a very positive view of the human being. It says as long as we don't do things that bring the dirt, the defilement onto ourselves, by default, there we are. The light of holiness shines clearly. And it's like, if you imagine a lamp, it's like saying, don't worry about the light. The light's there. What you have to pay attention to is the condition of the light fixture. If the light fixture around the light is all dirty and it's accumulated bugs over the winter and there's spider webs and all kinds of what's technically called schmutz, just dirt, it doesn't matter that the light is pure. It's not going to shine into the world because of all the stuff, all the impediments that have grown around it that inhibit that light from shining clearly. So Rashi's position is very interesting, and in a sense, from my point of view, it's very beautiful. because it's telling us that we are holy now, our default position. What we come to by nature is our holiness. That was the first teaching. But then Rabbi Pear pointed out to me very quickly that within 2 centuries there was a teacher, 2 centuries, short period of time in Jewish thought and practice. That's like a conversation is going on if somebody responds 2 centuries later. But it was the Ramban. Ramban is Nachmanides, not to be confused with Rambam, who is Maimonides. Nachmanides, Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, who lived after Maimonides. So you get Rashi, and then you get Rambam, and then you get Ramban. He said about what Rashi had said about holiness, he said, that can't possibly be true. Can't possibly be true. It's not wrong, but it can't be the whole picture. Because you can do things which are not defiling. They're not sinful. There's nothing wrong with the thing itself. But when I give you a few examples, you can see they can't also possibly represent holiness. And he gave the example of somebody who was eating kosher food. Absolutely kosher. Glatt kosher. Kosher. Nobody could dispute this kosher status of this food, but was eating it like a glutton. So the actual food itself was not defiling. There's nothing in it that was problematic. But the appetite, the way it was being done, was so unattractive, so demeaning, with so little dignity. He said, how could that be holy? And he brought 2 other examples. He said, somebody could drink kosher wine until they pass out. So kosher wine, nothing defiling about that. Nothing in our tradition says that wine is in any way problematic. But if a person drinks it to excess, they're going to end up under the table. And that can't possibly be holiness. And the third example he brings is permitted sex. In other words, in a consummated relationship, a consecrated relationship, that to be preoccupied and so involved in physical sensation and really like living your life revolving around that kind of thing. He said that too. It's permitted. It's not defiling. It's completely consecrated. But you can do it in a way that is so clearly not reflecting holiness, that it can't just be a matter of stay away from the defiling. And what he added, he wasn't just being a critic of Rashi. He brought something himself. He said, what you see in this situation is that you have to stay away from, if you want to be holy, you have to stay away from that which defiles you. And that's not just matters of, like he brought, but it's also gossip. It's also theft. It's also fiddling with this or that, or just all the aspects of human life that we will be looking at in this course, where your anger, or your impatience, or your ingratitude, or your stinginess, or whatever it may be that we'll focus on, that is what you have to stay away from, that is defiling. And at the same time, you have to be disciplined in that which is permitted. That was the addition that the Ramban brought. That you have to be self-disciplined in the area of the permitted. Because we're permitted to do many things. We're permitted to speak. We're permitted to have relations with other people. We don't have monasteries and monastic life. We enjoy food. Judaism is not a religion of asceticism. So it comes back to us to be disciplined in the area of the permitted. That also is an aspect of holiness. So in these 2 interpretations, they're not in conflict with one another. They add together. And you get a sense of not defiling yourself and being self-disciplined in the areas where there's nothing wrong with what you're doing, and still you're disciplined. That becomes the sense of the path towards holiness as you work in all the inner traits that we're talking about and we'll work on in this course, which are inner traits, but you'll see that they all have behavioral components. It's not just about gratitude, it's about expressing gratitude. It's not just about the theory of generosity, it's about being generous. It's not just about the definition of humility, it's about being humble. So there really is a behavioral component in that. But I wanted to share one more thing that Rabbi Kerr said on this very same conversation. He shared about Rashi saying, don't defile yourself. He shared Ramban saying, discipline yourself in the area of the permitted. And he said one more thing. He said, but it's very hard to define holiness, he said, because holiness is a divine quality. We're human, we're earthly. It's very hard for us to put our minds around and our language around something which has such an elevated, ineffable quality. How can we define anything that is like God's quality? So, well, I know what that is. Here's my definition of that. And what he said is that sometimes he said, I have looked into the eyes of certain individuals in my life, and I have felt my heart was purified. He said that's also a definition of holiness. That I have looked into the eyes of certain individuals in my life, and in that moment I felt my heart was purified. Those are exactly his words. And what that adds into our understanding of holiness is that it's one thing to understand it and to turn it into behavioral rules. It's another thing to understand it as an experience. He related it to looking into the eyes of holy individuals, which he said has only happened to him a few times in his life. But it's experiential. And I think this is very important to add into the mix, because there's a very strong tendency in Judaism, and in Reform Judaism in particular, to be very intellectual in our understandings of religion and spirituality. The mind is a wonderful thing. What Rashi said and Ramban says, he began with that because it really sets the stage. But we don't only know things through the mind. We also know things through the heart. We know things through direct experience. There are moments when a person feels, I am in the presence of holiness. I trust those moments. I think those moments are very informative. I think they tell us something that we can relate to because it is so clear in our experience that in that moment there is such profound purity and refinement and elevation, radiance, something so transcendent. And we're participating in it. And it's undeniable because it's our experience. I value that Rabbi Kerr shared that with me because it helps me broaden out to include what I know through my mind and what I know through my heart. And the two together are very important on a spiritual journey. The mind needs to lead, but the heart needs to follow. If only the mind is present, if only the mind leads, it becomes all theoretical. If it's only the heart, you stay right where you are, because that's where your heart already is. To set something out there and then follow it with your heart is the Mussar process. And one great Mussar teacher, Rabbi Elia Lopian, defined Mussar as making the heart understand what the mind knows. The mind knows, and then having the heart understand. We can define Kedusha, holiness, but how do we make the heart understand it so it becomes part of the way we see the world, not just through the filter of definition, but experientially? And sometimes I like to say that what's very clear to me is that God set up the world like Costco. I don't know if you have Costco where you are. Costco's in most places. We have Costco here in Vancouver. And you might ask, how is it that God set up the world like Costco? The answer is that Costco has free samples in every aisle. And God set up the world with free samples in every aisle. I'm willing to bet that everybody who is on this webinar has, in one way or another, at one time or another, had an experience that so transcended, that felt so much like another realm, a much more radiant, pure, elevated, refined realm, was piercing through into this world. And the heart was right there, experiencing it, and it was a moment, and it was a transient experience, but it was a moment that was so true That's a free sample in aisle 16. I believe that God gives us and set up the world so we don't have to do a spiritual practice or be religious people to have that sample of holiness. We just have to know what it is and trust that our experience is true. And once we do, then we can come back to the religion and spiritual practice and say, I know a bit about what this is about. I know a bit about what this is about. I have a sense from my own experience of what it is when I have not defiled myself. Because if you've defiled yourself in that moment can be right there, but you're not going to be able to access it because you've created the shell, you've created the obstacle to being so open and available to transcendence. And the same is true about the self-discipline. It may not be a matter of defilement. It may be that you're so engrossed in something else, you're not even noticing. It's not that what you're engrossed in is prohibited or defiling. It's just distracting. It's just you're too involved in that. And it's, in the case of the Ramban brings, they're all material things, whether it's food or drink or physical pleasure. It's all worldly, not worldly as much as material. It's on the material plane. Well, pay attention to the spiritual because you're lost in the material. So that's really the goal, the orientation. Saying, pay attention. You probably have had experiences where it felt like your heart was purified in that moment by something that was so transcendent. Okay, now you know. You have a taste. Just like Costco's theory. Give them a taste. They'll want to take home the big package. And so too with Judaism, we want you to take home the big package of holiness. You can draw on those little experiences you've had, and then through that understanding of the heart, have an inkling of what we're talking about. And then put yourself to work, and know that impatience can be a kind of defilement, and stinginess can be a kind of defilement. But so too can profligate generosity. For that you have to be restrained. And so too in all the other qualities, there's an element of restraint and there's an element of participation. You can see these as being the guidelines for the boundaries of the midot, the soul traits for the sake of pursuing holiness. So I want to share one other thing, and then we'll go to questions. So I've really tried to open up and explain more about holiness and relate it to your own experience, but also place it into inherent Jewish context. The Mussar teachers talk about one other thing. They talk about shlemut. Shlemut, or shlemus, as it might be said, means wholeness. Not holiness, wholeness. W-H-O-L, as in to be whole, to be complete. They see that one of the ways of understanding all the traits that we'll study and work on in this course, and all the traits that there are, is that all of us have traits which at one time or another, they're very complete. Each of us has certain traits that are very sound. They really are, if you think of it as being partial or whole, each of us at this very moment has certain traits which are really quite whole. And we also have ones which are partial. An example of that would be being impatient. Or we talk about Hakar Hatov is the Hebrew for gratitude. Hakar Hatov is to recognize the good. And the opposite is Kafui Hatov, which means to cover up the good. Somebody does something for you, or there's something really good going on in your life, and you find everything is negative about it. You cover up the good. He's only doing it for his own sake. He just feels badly and is just trying to guilt me. Whatever it is, there's some rationale to not recognize the good that's coming your way. That's kafui hatov. And if a person is caught in that pattern of anger, pattern of laziness, pattern of covering up the good, miserliness, worry, envy. There's so many ways in which you can get caught in your own personal life and be partial in that area, not quite fully realized. And the Mussar teacher says where we aim is to become whole. You can see that this fits together with holiness, because the very same things in which we are partial are the same things that will be obstacles on the journey towards holiness. So in a way, they're setting a kind of practical goal that leads to the ultimate goal. The practical goal is to be whole, to work on those areas of your incompleteness, to complete them in order to go on the journey towards holiness, which is the ultimate goal. And as an analogy, you might think of it like having a car. You're going to go on a long road journey. What you do is you get your car tuned up, you fill the gas tank, you wash the windows, you fill the windshield wiper washer. You get the car all ready. But that's not the goal. You need to do that. That's the wholeness. That's the shlemut. And then you've got the car. It can go on the road and take you towards the destination you're seeking, and that's holiness. You do find the Mussar Institute talk about both, whether they're talking about the ultimate goal or the fact that, in a way, you won't be able to even think about the ultimate goal if you haven't got the mechanism in place. So sometimes they focus very much on the mechanism. The two go hand in hand. When we see that and we hear that, then we know that what this is about, this practice and this study, and put it the other way around, this study and this practice, really has two qualities that are worth underlining. One is that it's quite, the bar is high. The other is that it's very Jewish. It is intrinsically Jewish. I don't know if you could I'm not familiar with another spiritual tradition where the discussion would be so focused on the quality of holiness. Not even a spiritual tradition, a psychological tradition, or a self-help tradition, a religious tradition, or a spiritual tradition. This is intrinsically Jewish. And it's very, very ambitious. It's very demanding in a certain way. And I want to comment on that. Because, as I said at the beginning, it's not something that we should think, I'm going to get there. I'm going to get to the point that one day you wake up and say, Martha, I'm holy now. I did it. I made it. I'm at the top. And then it's over. And then you can just glide for the rest of your life because you got the star on your shoulder and it's over. Not the Jewish view either. In a way, we never get there. It's an orientation point. It's not that we become holy, it's that we're on a journey towards holiness. We have realized that there can't be anything to which one could dedicate their life that has anything near the profundity and the intrinsic value of holiness. And we set that up as the direction we're going, and we know we have to work on our partialness to get more whole in order to go towards that goal, but we don't judge. How am I doing? Am I getting there yet? Am I there? I reached the point. It's like saying, I used to have a problem with humility. Now I'm very humble. I'm really good at humility. I'm one of the best humble people I know. Nobody is as humble as me. And that's exactly what can happen if you get stuck on evaluation. No, there's something that is out there. It's a point on the horizon, like the magnetic north that attracts the compass point. It's where we're journeying towards. We're accompanying each other on a journey in the direction that is set by the flag of holiness, but we don't get caught into thinking, okay, I'm gonna get there. And not only that, I'm gonna measure myself. Better to look at, was I patient today? Was I generous today? Was I overly patient today? Was I overly generous? Because, in the Musar paradigm, the quality itself is not the issue. Either extreme, whether it's too much or too little, becomes the point of focus. I don't want to. You'll get more and more of that as we go on. You'll understand more and more of that. That's the Mussar paradigm for how to work on yourself. But what I wanted to cover with you this evening was really what I've talked about. Understanding the place of holiness in this practice as the ultimate goal, and yet knowing that in a way it's our intrinsic nature, even as we are, how to expose that so that light shines brighter into our world and into our own lives. And understand shlemut, wholeness. It's interesting that the word shlemut, you may hear in it that there's another Hebrew word you're more familiar with that has the same linguistic root, which is the word shalom. And the idea to be whole is the only way to become peaceful. The only possibility. If there's a partialness, if it's broken, it's like a wheel that doesn't have enough, think for some reason of another car analogy, it's going ba-bump, 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 ba-bump. If you're in that car, it's not a very peaceful ride. And it's riding like that because one of the tires is not whole. That's the analogy for how it is for us. As long as inner traits of ours are still partial, then we are not shalem, which is the Hebrew word for whole. We are not shalem, and therefore we do not have shalom. And when we don't have that, holiness is out of reach. So I've shared what I wanted to share with you, and now I want to see if I can find the chat on my screen. If you have any questions, let me see. I haven't been able to open it yet. Oh, there we are. Okay, so I see where we are, and I now can clarify everyday holiness, which I imagine you have. So I get a question here. Please discuss how the Mussar work can or will affect our relationships with others who aren't necessarily practice Mussar. It may affect them, it may not. It may affect your relationships, it may not. I mean, that's not, it's perfectly in line with this discussion to say that that's not our goal. But if you look at it, you say, look, I'm going to be working on myself in the areas of my incompleteness with a goal of wholeness and holiness. How can that not affect the relationships you have? How can it not affect the people around you? And it tends to be that people who do Mussar work come back to me, or that you'll say in your group or someone, that you can see the changes affecting everyday life, and that the relationships and your sense of yourself, the things that you've always tripped over, that you suddenly realize that there's growth happening in those areas, and that you don't have to keep repeating the same behavior over and over again. There are pathways for change. You know, I often use the example of impatience because it's the thing that everybody's plagued with these days. Either plagued with their own impatience or other people's impatience. But we have perfected an impatient society. We move at such a high pace. You know, if I haven't answered an email within 24 hours, I begin my answer with an apology. And so that's very significant. And the thing is that when a person is impatient, they suffer more than anybody else. But if a person realizes that, or goes to, let's say, what Musar shows, that you don't have to be impatient. I mean, that's not to say you're not going to be waiting, or you're not going to run into slow people, or things aren't, going to suddenly fall into place magically. Not that. But you are the master of your response to the situation. When that happens, you can see how that will affect relationships too. People in relationships get caught in patterns and loops. When one person realizes, wait a minute, the thing that really bugs me about that person is true, but I don't have to react to it the way I used to, that my reaction is on my curriculum. Doesn't make the other person's behavior good. But how I react, my curriculum, I'm going to change my reaction. And there are many stories, good Musar teaching stories, which we don't have time for, about how when one person changes themselves, they can change a relationship, and they can, in fact, change other people, change those people too. I've heard lots of stories from students about that. Question, please elaborate on where the specific group of midot come from. How did the rabbis decide which midot to study? In what way do these midot come from Torah? Well, 3 questions. There's no real specific group of midot. Every inner experience that humans have is what the rabbis were looking at. Because if we have it as an inner experience, how does it work? What's the good in it and what's the negative in it? I was teaching a class earlier this week from a 16th century text, and it says that what this text is going to show you is how to do is choose the most select in every trait. It wasn't saying, I'm going to teach you how to choose which are the good traits and which are the bad traits. The idea of, we have from Christianity, I don't remember how, 7 deadly sins and the 7 sort of heavenly virtues or whatever it is. That's not a Mussar approach, because patience is a virtue, is the adage in the culture at large, but that's not necessarily true. Patience is not necessarily a virtue. Patience may be entirely the wrong response in a situation. If you have a situation where you're responsible, you know what the problem is, you've got the tools to deal with it, and you're being inactive and rationalizing it by saying, I'm being patient, you're wrong. Patience is no virtue in that situation. You can do harm with generosity. And by the same token, there's a positive side to envy. It says in the Talmud, it says that the kinat sofrim karbe chochma, that the envy of the sages increases wisdom. How does that do that? It motivates people. People are motivated by envy. Now, if you go too far in envy, you have a negative, but the trait itself is not necessarily positive or negative. So the second question, how did the rabbis decide which midot to study? They studied all of them, and they were doing that in order that we could select from the smorgasbord the ones that were related to us. We provide a course where we lead you through this midah and this midah and this midah. But in reality, when you get through it, and ultimately you have to use that as a reflection on yourself, because the only course of midah study, of Mussar study, that really matters is that which is related to your own life. We may teach you about becoming more patient. That may actually not apply to you. We may teach you about becoming more generous. You may need to restrain your generosity. Everybody has a personal spiritual curriculum. We're learning about this field of study and this paradigm, and there's great learning in each of these things. But ultimately it comes down to, how about you? Where does this come in you? Which midot in you do you have a tendency to go to the extremes, one way or the other? In what way do these midot come from Torah? They don't really. The midot don't come from Torah. Lessons in the midot we can get from Torah. The midot themselves are human nature. Anger is part of all human beings. Kindness is part of all human beings. It may be really minimal, but it's there. It's part of our makeup. Worry, trust, joy, sadness. What they're understanding, and this is really what Musar is about, is that how we are put together as human beings gives us the pathway of our own growth. We don't have to go after some remote mountain or some institution or some cave. We've got it here. It's everyday life. Everyday life is reflecting back to us the path of our own growth. Somebody once said to me, are there any Musar classes around here? And I said, yeah, in Starbucks, in the grocery store, on the freeway. You'll get Musar lessons all over the place. And my students referred to Mussar moments. I had a Mussar moment because that's when real life is showing you. That midah is on your curriculum. So we learned things from the Torah. For example, the quality, the thing that kept Moses from going into the promised land was an action that he did, which was motivated by anger. So we learned something about anger. And you can see through all the Torah stories, reflections and learning about midot. For example, one of the things the Mussar teachers teach is that we get tested in life. We learn where our curriculum is by what tests us. And you find Abraham, who was the master of kindness and generosity. He was an enormously effective host and generous to guests, hospitable and kind. And it said Abraham was the master of chesed, which is loving kindness. And it is often said that Abraham faced 10 tests in his life. And they were all tests not of kindness. He didn't get tested by that. He got tested by gevurah, strength, might. And he had to go to war. And of course, the ultimate test out of the 10, many commentators say, was the demand that he sacrifice his own son. Hardly an act of kindness. Kindness was no challenge to him. The other side of his nature needed to be developed, and that's where he got tested. All his 10 tests in the areas of gevurah. So the midot come from us. Your own experience, your life experience is the raw material of Mussar study. We can learn from here, we learn from there. Where the tradition comes in very helpfully is that we're not the first human beings. We didn't make up this nature of ours. We have the gift of generations coming before us because human nature has not changed very much in the last few thousand years. And we can learn and benefit from their experience. To touch on a couple more, and then I think we'll be done. See if I can do this quickly and stay within the hour. You mentioned in your book that a quantitative approach of journaling is not helpful. Have you heard from some who find it sufficient? I think my first interpretation of that question is probably wrong. My first thought was quantitative means writing a lot, which is not helpful, just to sort of like write a lot, as opposed to being specific. But I don't think that's what the question is. The quantitative approach, if I am understanding correctly, and if I'm not, then we'll take this conversation offline and you can email me and I'll get it right, hopefully the next time, is that the idea of journaling really comes out of a book that was published in the early part of the 19th century, 1807, I think, called Cheshbon HaNefesh by Rabbi Menachem Mendel Leffin. And this book, which was, that the rabbi published 1807, I mean, it's pretty amazing that he was really working with journaling at that time. And he said, he provided a checklist. And if you look in his book, which is published, it's available in English translation right now, published in English as Cheshbon HaNefesh, it didn't translate the title. But that means accounting of the soul. That he provides charts, and you follow charts. I see that, okay, you've refined the question of a checklist approach. That's exactly what he does. He provides a chart, and you check off. Was that generous today? Check off. And I find that not helpful. I think that it doesn't lead to insight. It leads to success and failure mentality, as opposed to growth mentality. I find it much more useful to explore and bring to awareness the factors that were involved in a situation so that you have greater clarity about what you did. I've learned things from my journal because very often what happens in writing out an episode is that it's very minor in and of itself. But 4 days later, another episode happens, and it's very reminiscent of the first episode. And each one is minor, but you can start to connect the dots. And if you had let that episode go in some way without reflecting on it and brought it to consciousness the next time, I don't know if you would connect the dots. Just to look on it sort of behaviorally, which is what the chart form does, is I say, okay, I practice generosity today, now I go on. Practice generosity today, now I go on. It's very behavioral. It doesn't lead to as much insight, so I don't prefer that. Okay, so Jeff has written out the title. Okay, and the last point is actually the last question from Sharon. Really relate to this. She says, you mentioned that we should not get stuck in evaluation. Is there any way we measure our growth? This is very much the same point in a way, although it's coming from your question was motivated by something different, but it comes to the same point, because that's why I'm not in favor of kind of adding up the check points on the chart kind of approach. Even though there is a valid Musar approach, yeah, I can, point to the book, Heshbon HaNefesh, and if somebody finds that valuable, I can't dispute it. It has a heritage to it. Not my style, not what I advocate. Doesn't work for me. I just say that. But that's it's basically an evaluative approach. I don't get so caught up in evaluation. I used, and this is a good teaching, I think, from a source to wrap up with, which is that there was a great Mussar teacher who died in 2005. So we're talking about 9 years ago. His name was Rabbi Shlomo Wolbe. And you'll encounter his teachings in the course. More in the course than the book, because the book was written in 2007. So since that time, I've studied more of Rabbi Shlomo Wolbe's writings, which are not in English. And it's taken me 7 years to learn Hebrew. But he wrote a great Musar book that probably will never be translated into English because his family wants to keep it in Hebrew. He said, on the topic of Shleimut, he said, you're only as whole as your current test. You're only as whole as your current test. So let's say you're working on generosity. Your wholeness is only in that moment when you are generous. It doesn't guarantee you anything about the next time you're going to be in a situation where your generosity may be called upon again. The fact that you did it last time doesn't mean you can say, I'm whole in the area of generosity. I got this one covered. You're only as whole as your current test. What I love about that teaching is it keeps it alive in the moment. There's no room for complacency and rationalization. It's like saying every test is a unique moment. The present is a unique moment. I'm working on cultivating certain traits, and I may well have made great progress in it. But in this moment, that progress is not relevant. What's relevant is the current test. Keeping the focus on how am I going to respond to this situation? Who do I want to be in response? Now, what in me do I want to cultivate? That's all very much in the moment and very focused on the present rather than sort of trying to formulate an evaluation. Say, cumulatively, I've gone here, there, and everywhere. How far have I gone on the journey? More important than how far I've gone on the journey is the direction my feet are moving. That's a very Musar approach and a humble approach. There's no room for pride in that. You have to stay constantly aware of which way your feet are moving because that's the whole of the process. So with that, I'm going to say we've hit 6 o'clock, and 6 o'clock out here on the West Coast, 9 o'clock for you on the East Coast, and various hours in between. So I want to thank you. I hope this was of some value to you, clarified and maybe motivated a bit, and it just made sense of what we're involved with here in a way that's hard to get from written text. My email address is alan, A-L-A-N, at mussarinstitute.org, spelled with 2 S's, Mussar with 2 S's, just as it is. So if you have any further questions or I can elaborate on anything, good, Jeff put it up into chat. That's my email address. I'm very happy to respond to email, follow up. If there's anything further to clarify, please be in touch with me. Once you're involved in a program at the Mussar Institute, I have the responsibility of a teacher to students, and that includes answering questions and being helpful if I can be. So please don't hesitate to be in touch if there's anything I can do. Good. So I wish you well and a good week, and I look forward to continuing to walk this road with you into the future.